The rain had already begun to fall when the Jeep arrived at the edge of the American medical station, somewhere in the Pacific in early 1945. The camp was small, little more than a cluster of canvas tents, wooden crates, and a few makeshift medical tables under tarps. Lanterns swung slowly in the evening wind, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. The sign near the entrance read simply, U.S. Army Medical Station. For the medics stationed there, it was another long day in a war that seemed to stretch endlessly across the ocean. Most of the wounded arriving at this field station were American soldiers evacuated from nearby fighting. Some came in with shrapnel wounds, others with tropical diseases, and many with exhaustion from months of combat in jungle conditions. The doctors and corpsmen had seen nearly everything the Pacific War could produce, or at least they thought they had. That evening, two infantry soldiers jumped out of the jeep and moved quickly toward the largest medical tent. One of them turned back and carefully lifted something from the rear seat. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of blankets, but it wasn't. The soldiers carried the bundle inside and gently placed it onto a wooden examination table. A few of the medics standing nearby stopped what they were doing. One of them stepped forward and slowly pulled the blanket back. The room went silent. Lying on the table was a woman. Her body was so thin that at first the medics struggled to understand what they were seeing. Her arms were little more than bone covered by fragile skin. Her cheeks had collapsed inward, and her ribs were sharply visible beneath the thin fabric that covered her. One of the corpsmen whispered under his breath, almost without realizing it, She's a skeleton." Another medic quickly checked her pulse, placing two fingers carefully against her neck. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up. "She's alive." That surprised everyone in the tent. The soldiers who had brought her in explained that they had discovered her earlier that afternoon near the remains of an abandoned Japanese supply position deep in the jungle. At first, they thought she was already dead. She had been lying in the dirt beside a collapsed bamboo shelter, barely moving. But when one of the soldiers knelt beside her, he noticed her eyes slowly open. She had tried to speak, but no sound came out. Now, under the dim lantern light of the medical tent, the doctors began their examination. One of them reached for the field scale normally used to weigh injured soldiers. When they carefully lifted her onto it, the reading stunned everyone in the room. 63 pounds. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the experienced doctors struggled to process the number. An adult woman weighing only 63 pounds was something they had never encountered before. The senior medic quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I don't understand how she's still alive." Another doctor crouched beside the table, studying her carefully. Her breathing was slow and shallow, but steady. Her eyes moved slightly, following the figures around her, though she seemed too weak to react. Someone asked the obvious question, "Is she military?" The soldiers shook their heads. They had found no weapon, no uniform, nothing that clearly identified her role. Her clothing was worn and torn, the kind often used by civilian laborers or auxiliary workers attached to Japanese forces during the war. In the Pacific Theater, it was not uncommon for civilians to become trapped between armies as front lines shifted across islands. Many worked in supply units, cooking, carrying equipment, or building temporary shelters. But nothing explained the extreme condition of the woman now lying on the medical table. One of the medics brought a cup of water and carefully touched it to her lips. At first, there was no reaction. Then, slowly, she moved. Her lips trembled slightly. The doctor quickly stopped the attempt. "Not too much," he warned. "If she's been starving this long, even water too fast could be dangerous." The medics exchanged uneasy glances. Treating battlefield wounds was routine for them. Treating someone suffering from extreme starvation was something entirely different. They began speaking quietly among themselves, trying to decide what to do. How long could someone survive like this? Maybe weeks, maybe longer if she had small amounts of food. Where would she even get food out there? Outside the tent, the rain intensified, drumming steadily against the canvas roof. The jungle beyond the camp was dark and dense, a place where supply lines often disappeared, and soldiers on both sides sometimes vanished without explanation. One of the infantry soldiers leaned against the tent pole and spoke again. When we found her, there was nothing around. No food, no supplies, just the shelter and a few empty containers. Another medic examined her hands. Her fingers were thin and stiff, the skin cracked from dehydration. There were small cuts along her palms, as if she had spent days digging or searching through rough terrain. It suggested something troubling. She likely had been trying to survive alone. The senior doctor stood quietly at the foot of the table, studying her condition. In 20 years of medical service, he had treated soldiers in multiple conflicts, but he had never seen starvation this severe in someone still alive. He finally spoke. If we feed her too quickly, it could kill her. The others looked at him. When the body has been starving this long, the organs slow down. If we suddenly give normal food, the shock can stop the heart. One of the younger corpsmen frowned. So what do we do? He paused before answering. We start slow, very slow. Another lantern was lit in the tent as night settled fully over the camp. The medics prepared a small mixture of diluted broth, carefully measured. When they gently raised her head and allowed a few drops to touch her lips, something unexpected happened. Her eyes opened wider. For the first time since arriving at the medical station, there was a visible reaction. She swallowed. The medics exchanged quiet looks. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but in that moment, it meant something important. She still had the strength to fight. Outside the tent, soldiers moved through the rain as the camp continued its routine operations. Radios crackled with distant reports from other units. Supply trucks arrived and departed through the mud. But inside the small medical tent, the attention of every doctor and corpsman had shifted entirely to the fragile figure lying on the wooden table. No one knew her name. No one knew how long she had been alone in the jungle. And no one yet understood the full story of how a woman weighing only 63 pounds had managed to survive long enough to reach their camp. But one thing was already clear to everyone present. Her survival was nothing short of extraordinary.
Weeks before she appeared at the American medical station, her story had already become a desperate struggle for survival somewhere deep in the Pacific jungle. Long before the soldiers found her lying beside the ruined bamboo shelter, she had been part of a small Japanese supply detachment operating far from the main front lines. By 1944 and early 1945, the war in the Pacific had begun to collapse for many Japanese units scattered across islands and jungle territories. Supply routes were constantly disrupted by American naval blockades and air attacks. Entire outposts were sometimes cut off without warning, leaving soldiers and support personnel stranded with little food and no communication. In one such remote area, a small group of Japanese soldiers and civilian auxiliaries had been stationed near a temporary supply point hidden in the jungle. Their task had been simple in theory: maintain a storage position where ammunition, medical equipment, and food could be distributed to units moving through the region. But war rarely followed simple plans. American forces had already begun advancing across nearby islands and coastal positions, gradually isolating many Japanese detachments. Air reconnaissance planes often spotted supply trails, and bombing runs could destroy depots within minutes. What had once been a functioning support post quickly turned into a place of uncertainty. The woman who would later arrive at the American medical tent was likely one of the civilians attached to this supply group. During the Pacific War, many Japanese women were assigned to auxiliary roles, supporting military units. Some worked as clerks or cooks, others helped carry supplies through difficult terrain where vehicles could not travel. Life at such outposts was harsh even under normal conditions. The jungle climate brought constant humidity, insects, disease, and unpredictable storms. Food deliveries were often irregular, and when supply ships were sunk or cargo aircraft were shot down, shortages could begin almost immediately. At first, the group stationed at the jungle supply point probably believed the disruption would be temporary, perhaps a few days, maybe a week. Military orders would arrive and the situation would stabilize. But days turned into weeks, and the supplies never came. The rice stores began shrinking quickly. What had once been a carefully rationed reserve soon became the only food left for the entire detachment. Soldiers and civilians alike were forced to reduce their daily portions. For a while, they survived on half rations, then quarter rations. Eventually, even that became impossible. The jungle itself offered very little to eat for people unfamiliar with its plants. Some soldiers tried catching small animals or searching for edible roots, but success was rare. Many plants were poisonous, and even experienced jungle troops sometimes died after eating the wrong leaves or fruit. Starvation began slowly. First came weakness and fatigue, then dizziness. Men who had once carried heavy equipment could barely stand for long periods. Tasks that had taken minutes now required hours. As the weeks passed, the entire group began to deteriorate. Clothing hung loosely from bodies that had grown thinner each day. Faces lost their color. The once organized routines of the supply post slowly collapsed as survival became the only priority. For the woman among them, the situation may have been even more difficult. Without the physical strength of trained soldiers, she would have struggled more quickly against hunger and exhaustion. At some point, the group likely realized that help was not coming. American forces were advancing across the region, and Japanese command structures in isolated areas were beginning to break down. Radios sometimes failed. Messengers sent through the jungle often never returned. Eventually, the supply post was abandoned. Some of the soldiers may have attempted to reach other Japanese units deeper inland. Others might have tried to hide, hoping the front lines would move again and bring reinforcements. But traveling through the jungle while starving was nearly impossible. The woman was left behind. Whether by accident or because she was too weak to move, no one could later say. What is known is that she somehow continued to survive after the rest of the group disappeared. She constructed a small shelter using bamboo poles and torn fabric. The structure was crude, barely strong enough to withstand heavy rain, but it gave her some protection from the constant storms that swept through the jungle. Each day became a search for anything edible. She may have tried gathering wild leaves or insects. In extreme starvation conditions, people often consume whatever they can find: small roots, bark, even grass. Many such attempts bring little nutrition and can sometimes make the body even weaker. Her body began to change dramatically. Fat reserves disappeared first, then muscle tissue began to break down as the body searched for energy wherever it could find it. Arms and legs grew thinner, the face hollowed. Movements became slower and more painful. But somehow she remained alive. Days passed in silence beneath the jungle canopy. The sounds of war occasionally echoed far away: distant artillery, aircraft engines overhead, the faint rumble of explosions along the coast. But no one came. By the time American soldiers eventually discovered the shelter, the woman had likely been alone for weeks. The bamboo structure had partially collapsed under heavy rain. Empty containers and torn cloth were scattered across the ground. She had almost no strength left. When the patrol first approached the area, they were not even searching for survivors. Their mission had simply been to inspect what appeared to be an abandoned Japanese supply point spotted during aerial reconnaissance. One soldier noticed movement near the ruined shelter. At first, he assumed it was an animal,
But as the patrol moved closer, the shape became clearer. A human figure lay in the dirt beside the bamboo frame, barely moving. The soldiers approached cautiously, unsure whether it might be a trap or a wounded enemy soldier. Then they saw her face. Shock spread quickly through the group. None of them had ever seen a human being reduced to such a fragile state and still breathing. One soldier quietly knelt beside her and placed a hand near her shoulder. Her eyes slowly opened. For a moment she seemed confused, as if she could not fully understand what she was seeing. The uniforms were unfamiliar. The language spoken around her was foreign. But the presence of other people meant something important. She was no longer alone in the jungle. The soldiers quickly realized that leaving her there would almost certainly mean death within hours or days. After a brief discussion, they lifted her carefully and carried her back through the thick jungle trail towards their vehicle. No one spoke much during the journey. Each man was silently trying to understand how someone could survive in such a condition for so long. By the time the jeep finally reached the American medical station that evening, the rain had already begun to fall, and the medics waiting at the tent entrance had no idea they were about to witness one of the most astonishing survival stories any of them had ever encountered.
Inside the medical tent, the atmosphere slowly shifted from shock to intense concentration. The discovery of the starving prisoner had stunned everyone at first, but now the responsibility of keeping her alive rested entirely in the hands of the small team of American medics stationed at the camp. The woman lay almost motionless on the wooden examination table. Her breathing was faint but steady, her chest rising and falling so lightly that it was sometimes difficult to notice. One of the corpsmen adjusted the lantern hanging above the table, bringing a little more light to the fragile figure beneath it. Up close, her condition was even more alarming. Every bone in her arms was visible beneath the thin skin. Her wrists looked so delicate that one medic worried they might fracture if handled too roughly. Her shoulders had lost nearly all muscle, leaving sharp angles where healthy tissue should have been. But what concerned the doctors most was not just her appearance. It was the risk of what they called refeeding shock. One of the senior medics quietly gathered the younger corpsmen around the table and spoke in a calm but serious tone. He had seen starvation cases before in other parts of the war, though none this severe. When the body starves, he explained, it slows everything down: the heart, the kidneys, the stomach. They all begin conserving energy just to stay alive. He glanced at the woman again before continuing. If we suddenly give her normal food, the body can't handle it. Her heart could stop. The younger medics listened carefully. Most of them had been trained to treat gunshot wounds, infections, and battlefield trauma. Extreme starvation was something few had ever studied in detail. One of the corpsmen asked the question everyone was thinking. "So how do we bring her back?" The doctor answered simply, "Slowly." They began preparing the smallest possible portions of nourishment. A thin broth mixture was diluted carefully with water. Even that had to be measured in drops rather than sips. Another medic checked her pulse again. It was weak, but still present. Outside the tent, word had already begun spreading through the camp. Soldiers passing between supply trucks and communication posts whispered about the strange discovery. Some said the medics had found a prisoner who looked like a skeleton. Others claimed she weighed less than a child. Curiosity slowly pulled a few soldiers toward the medical tent entrance, though most kept their distance out of respect for the doctors working inside. Back in the tent, the medics carefully lifted the woman's head slightly and allowed a few drops of broth to touch her lips. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then her throat moved. She swallowed. The reaction was small, but it immediately lifted the mood in the room. One of the corpsmen exhaled quietly. "That's a good sign."
Encouraged but cautious, they waited several minutes before offering another small amount. Each movement had to be gentle. Even sitting up too quickly could cause dizziness or collapse in someone so severely weakened. The senior doctor watched closely, studying every change in her breathing and pulse. After the second attempt, her eyelids slowly fluttered open. For the first time since arriving at the camp, she seemed fully aware of her surroundings. Her eyes moved across the tent, observing the unfamiliar faces around her. The uniforms were different from anything she had seen before. The language spoken between the medics sounded strange and distant. One of the corpsmen spoke softly, though he knew she probably would not understand. "You're safe now." The woman blinked slowly. She tried to move her arm, but stopped halfway, as if the effort required too much strength. The medics gently lowered it back to the blanket covering her. Another doctor began writing notes on a clipboard, documenting her condition. Even in wartime, medical records were carefully kept whenever possible. Cases like this were rare, and understanding how the body responded could help save others in the future. Weight, 63 pounds. Pulse, weak but stable. Severe malnutrition, extreme dehydration. Possible weeks of starvation. The doctor paused as he wrote the final note. Condition, critical. As the night deepened, the camp outside continued its routine operations. Trucks arrived with crates of supplies. Radio operators exchanged reports with nearby units. Somewhere beyond the jungle, distant artillery could occasionally be heard echoing across the hills. But inside the medical tent, time seemed to move differently. Every few minutes, the medics checked her pulse again. They adjusted the blanket to keep her warm. A small lantern burned steadily beside the table, casting soft light across the quiet scene. Around midnight, something unexpected happened. The woman spoke. The sound was barely audible, more like a whisper carried by weak breath. None of the medics immediately understood the words, but the fact that she could speak at all surprised them. One of the soldiers standing near the entrance leaned closer. It sounded like Japanese. The camp happened to have one man who could understand a small amount of the language. He had studied basic Japanese phrases during intelligence training earlier in the war. When he stepped closer and listened carefully, he caught a single word. Mizu. He turned to the others. "She's asking for water." The doctors exchanged cautious looks. Water could help her, but too much too quickly could also cause complications in a body that had been deprived for so long. They allowed only a tiny amount, just enough to wet her lips. She swallowed again, slowly. Her eyes closed afterwards, as if even that small effort had exhausted her completely. The medics stepped back slightly, giving her time to rest. One of the younger corpsmen leaned quietly against a supply crate and shook his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe she survived out there." Another medic nodded. "In that condition, most people wouldn't last more than a few days." The senior doctor looked down at the fragile figure resting on the table. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the human body surprises us." Outside, the rain that had started earlier in the evening finally began to fade. The jungle air cooled as clouds slowly drifted away from the moon. Inside the medical tent, the lantern light flickered gently against the canvas walls. The woman who had been found alone in the jungle was still alive, and for the first time in many weeks, someone was watching over her.
Morning came slowly to the small medical station. The jungle air was thick with humidity, and a pale gray light filtered through the canvas walls of the tents as the sun rose somewhere beyond the dense trees. Inside the medical tent, the lantern that had burned through the night was finally extinguished, replaced by the softer light of early morning. The woman was still alive. For the medics who had spent the entire night monitoring her condition, that alone felt like a small victory. Her pulse remained weak, but it had not disappeared. Her breathing was still shallow but steady. For someone who had arrived weighing only 63 pounds, surviving the first night was far from guaranteed. One of the corpsmen quietly checked the field scale again, though everyone already knew the number. Nothing about her condition had changed enough to affect her weight. The figure remained almost impossible to believe. The senior doctor stood beside the examination table, studying her face carefully. Starvation had left deep shadows around her eyes, and the bones of her cheeks remained sharply visible beneath the skin. But there was something slightly different now. Her breathing seemed a little stronger. It was not a dramatic change, but it was enough for the experienced doctor to notice. He turned toward the others in the tent. "She's holding on." The words were simple, but they carried real meaning. In cases of extreme starvation, the body could sometimes collapse suddenly, even after appearing stable. Organs weakened by weeks without food could fail without warning. But for now, she remained alive. The medics began their morning routine cautiously. A small portion of diluted broth was prepared again, even thinner than before. Every step had to be controlled carefully. Feeding too much could trigger a dangerous reaction known among doctors as refeeding syndrome, a sudden shift in the body's chemistry that could stop the heart. The corpsman who had helped during the night gently lifted her head again. Her eyes slowly opened as the spoon touched her lips. This time, the response came a little faster. She swallowed. Another small sip followed a few minutes later, then another. The medics waited between each attempt, watching her pulse and breathing closely. Even the smallest change in her condition could mean danger. Around midday, something happened that gave the doctors their first real sign of hope. She moved her hand. The motion was weak and slow, barely lifting a few inches from the blanket, but it was clearly intentional. One of the corpsmen quickly stepped forward and carefully supported her arm so it would not fall awkwardly. Her fingers trembled slightly before resting again. The younger corpsman looked at the senior doctor with cautious excitement. "That's the first real movement." The doctor nodded. "It means the body is responding." Outside the tent, life in the camp continued as usual. Soldiers cleaned their rifles, repaired equipment, and prepared supply crates for transport to nearby units. But the unusual story spreading through the camp had drawn quiet attention. Many soldiers had heard about the prisoner discovered in the jungle. Some had walked past the tent just to catch a glimpse through the open flap, though guards politely kept them from crowding the entrance. War created many strange moments, but this situation was different. The idea that someone could survive in such a condition fascinated and unsettled them at the same time. Inside, the medics focused only on their patient. As the afternoon passed, they began slowly increasing the frequency of the broth portions. The amount remained tiny, but her body seemed to tolerate it without immediate complications. Her eyes opened more often now. Each time she looked around the tent as if trying to understand where she was. The unfamiliar uniforms and equipment must have been confusing. Everything around her was different from the jungle shelter where she had spent her final days alone. One of the soldiers who had originally found her stopped by the tent entrance in the afternoon. He stood quietly for a moment, watching as the medics worked. He remembered the moment they had first discovered her lying in the dirt beside the broken bamboo structure. At that time, she had looked barely alive. Seeing her now, still fragile but breathing a little stronger, was almost difficult to believe. Later that day, the man who understood a small amount of Japanese returned to the tent. The doctors hoped that if the woman regained enough strength, they might learn more about what had happened to her. When she opened her eyes again, he knelt beside the table and spoke carefully. "Can you understand me?" For a moment, there was no response. Then her eyes shifted slightly toward him. He tried again, this time using one of the few Japanese phrases he knew. "Daijoubu desu. You are safe." Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not quite recognition, but it suggested she understood at least part of what had been said. Her lips moved slightly. The sound that came out was faint and broken, barely louder than breathing. The man leaned closer, trying to catch the words. It sounded like she was attempting to say something about food and about being alone. But her strength quickly faded again, and the effort of speaking left her exhausted. Her eyes closed shortly afterwards as she slipped back into sleep. The doctor gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "She's been through more than we can imagine," he said quietly. The medics in the tent understood what he meant. Weeks alone in the jungle, starving, searching desperately for anything that might keep her alive for one more day. The human body was not designed to endure such conditions for long. Yet somehow she had. As evening approached, the camp prepared for another night. Lanterns were lit once more, and the distant sounds of the jungle returned. Insects buzzing in the humid air, leaves shifting in the faint breeze. Inside the medical tent, the fragile survivor rested quietly on the examination table. She was still far from recovery. Her body remained dangerously weak, and the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But something important had changed. For the first time since she had been found in the jungle, the doctors began to believe that survival might actually be possible. By the third day at the American medical station, the story of the starving prisoner had spread far beyond the small jungle camp where she had first arrived. Soldiers from nearby units had heard about the woman who had been discovered weighing only 63 pounds, barely alive after weeks alone in the jungle. Some believed the story had been exaggerated. Others simply shook their heads, unable to imagine how anyone could survive in such a condition. Inside the medical tent, however, the reality remained fragile. The woman was still extremely weak, but the careful work of the medics had begun to show small results. Her pulse was stronger than it had been on the first night. Her breathing was steadier. The tiny portions of diluted broth were slowly being increased, though still in amounts far smaller than a healthy person would require. Recovery from starvation was never fast. The senior doctor explained this to the younger corpsmen as they continued their careful routine. "When the body loses this much weight," he said quietly, "every system has to rebuild itself. Muscles, organs, even the blood. It takes time." The medics followed strict precautions. Every meal was measured carefully. They watched for signs of swelling, irregular heartbeat, or sudden fatigue. Any one of those symptoms could signal dangerous complications. But despite the risks, something remarkable was happening. The woman was slowly regaining awareness. She spent less time unconscious now. When she opened her eyes, she sometimes watched the medics moving around the tent. The expressions on their faces were no longer just concern or confusion. There was also curiosity. They wanted to understand her story. One afternoon, the soldier who understood basic Japanese returned again. He carried a small notebook, hoping to write down anything she might be able to tell them. When she opened her eyes, he knelt beside the table and spoke gently. "Can you tell us your name?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then her lips moved slightly. The sound that came out was quiet and strained, but this time the word was clearer. The soldier listened carefully and wrote it down in the notebook. It was the first piece of her identity anyone in the camp had learned. Encouraged, he asked another question. "How long were you in the jungle?" She seemed to struggle to understand. The effort of concentrating showed on her face, as if the memory itself required strength she did not yet fully possess. After several seconds, she whispered something else. The soldier looked at the doctor. "I think she said many days." That was not surprising. Judging by her condition, everyone already suspected she had been alone for weeks. But hearing even a small confirmation from her made the story more real. Over the next day, the conversations continued in short, careful attempts. She was never strong enough to speak for long, and the medics always stopped the questions when she became too tired. Little by little, fragments of her experience began to emerge. The supply position where she had been stationed had slowly collapsed as food ran out. Some of the soldiers had left to search for other units. Others had grown too weak to travel. At some point, she had simply remained behind, surviving day by day in the shelter she had built. The soldier translating her words sometimes paused while writing, shaking his head quietly in disbelief. Even for men who had spent years surrounded by the harsh realities of war, the idea of surviving alone under those conditions seemed almost impossible. Yet she had done it. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the jungle trees, a few soldiers stood quietly outside the medical tent. They had no official reason to be there. Curiosity and respect had simply drawn near. One of them spoke softly. "Funny thing about war," he said. The others looked at him. "You spend years thinking about the enemy, fighting them, trying to defeat them." He glanced toward the tent where the fragile survivor rested inside. "Then something like this happens, and you realize it's just another human being trying to stay alive." The comment lingered in the air for a moment. Inside the tent, the medics continued their work. The woman had fallen asleep again after another small meal. Her body still had a long way to go before anything close to recovery could be considered certain, but the changes were undeniable. Her eyes had regained a little clarity. The trembling in her hands had slightly lessened. Even her voice, though still weak, had become a little easier to hear. The senior doctor reviewed his notes that night under the lantern light. Day 1, critical condition, severe starvation. Day 2, slight response to feeding. Day 3, increased awareness, limited speech. He placed the clipboard down and looked across the quiet tent. "2 days ago," he said to one of the corpsmen, "I wasn't sure she would survive the night." The corpsman nodded. "I don't think any of us were." The doctor folded his arms thoughtfully. "The human body is capable of incredible things." Outside, the jungle had grown dark again. The sounds of insects filled the warm night air, and somewhere in the distance an aircraft engine passed overhead, reminding everyone that the war beyond the trees was still very real. But inside the small medical tent, something else had begun to take shape. Not a victory, not a battle, but a story. A story of survival that none of the soldiers stationed at that camp would ever forget. A moment when the brutal divisions of war briefly gave way to something simpler, the determination to save a life. The woman who had once lain alone in the jungle, starving and forgotten, was no longer invisible. Her survival had stunned the medics who first saw her, and long after the war ended, the memory of the fragile prisoner who arrived weighing only 63 pounds would remain one of the most extraordinary moments many of them had ever witnessed.